And good evening. My name is David Greenham. I'm the Executive Director of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center. I'm sorry, I'm no longer the Executive Director of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center. That's hilarious. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Arts Commission. And I'm actually on the verge of celebrating my first anniversary as the Director of the Maine Arts Commission. And am very happy to be here tonight and thinking about how we can do a better job of working to talk about grants, talk about our grant writing, and also gain a better understanding of the kinds of services and conversations that we need to be having to support artists and organizations who are doing work in Maine. And so we're delighted to be here. Tonight on your screen, you see that Kerstin Gilg is here, our Grants Manager for the Maine Arts Commission, and then also two guests, Heather Stewart, who's a dancer and runs a dance organization, and also Ian Bannon, who is also a performing artist and also runs an arts organization. So both of them have experience of creating grants as individual artists, but also as creating grants for organizations. And so our hope is that we can really dig in a little bit into learning how they do their work, and then we'll broaden it out and talk a little bit with Kerstin, and they'll be here to answer questions as well, to talk a little bit more about some of the other questions that have come up and some of the other strategies that folks might use to write budgets and to make sure you're clear. We have the chat system here, and so if you have questions along the way, we would encourage you just to put them in the chat. I promise you that we're not going to get to all of them, but we are going to do our best to answer as many of the questions that we have, and then we will follow up with answers to questions as we move forward. And also here is Martha Biscuskis and Ryan Layton, and I'm not sure who else from the staff is here, but welcome to the rest of the staff and any commissioners who are here as well. And I'm sure folks will speak up as we go. So with that introduction, let's go ahead and dive right in. And so Heather, can you tell us a little bit about your process of thinking about budgets, creating budgets, and how you work on developing an application budget?
Yeah, usually the first thing that I'll look at is the program goals for the application that I'm applying for. So I'll take a good look to see if what the goals of this program or this grant that I'm applying for will fit in and make sense for me to write a budget for that. For example, if this is a grant that's really wanting to help support new work, then that changes the nature of what I'm going to write about in the application. I tend to work on my budgets alongside the narrative because I find that the two go hand in hand, and they shift and sort of end up pushing each other around a little bit. And if I were to start with the narrative first, I might come up with a great project or come up with a great idea, and then get to the end and look at the budget and realize that I might need potentially a lot more money or a lot less money than I had originally thought. So I definitely work on those things simultaneously. And as I'm working on the narrative questions, I'll go back and reference my budget to make sure that those two things are really in dialogue with each other, because I think that that's super important, is for the narrative and whatever it is that you're proposing in your application, it makes sense with the budget. Like, they shouldn't look like they're coming from two different places. And then the other thing I'll do is if there's, specific things that I need to get realistic numbers on, like if I'm traveling somewhere and need to house somebody, I'll go and like actually look up how much it's going to cost to house somebody there so that I have a real sense of what numbers are. And I try not to guess or estimate too many things if I can. So that hopefully, if I get the grant, then once I start putting the project in place, there aren't too many surprises.
Great, thank you. That's really, really helpful. Ian, how about you? How do you start that process?
Yeah, but a lot, like I totally agree with a lot of with everything that Heather said. For myself, just backing up like a step from the budget and thinking about granting in general, like if we were all business people sitting here, which I presume most of us are not, we would have had lessons on, like how to make a business plan and how to do market research and stuff that, like, as artists, we don't typically think about, and throughout my career, I've found that grant writing is actually like a great crash course in strategic planning and in planning a project to make sure that it's successful. So I encourage you guys, first of all, just to think about the grant writing process as like a template to make a successful project. Right? Like this, there are reasons that these questions are being asked. There's a reason that you look through your budget. Like Heather said, it's a real world cost. You aren't going to get surprised, as part of that process. And tagging on to what Heather said about like making sure that your program fits the grant, I would not try to I wouldn't let the tail wag the dog. None of us have capacity to do projects just to try and get money, because you can't make time grow on trees. And also, like, don't try and shoehorn a project into a grant that isn't a good fit, because grants are competitive, and you're going to be spinning your wheels, and chances are you might not get it. So once you know that there's like a great fit in terms of the budget, totally agree that there's back and forth between narrative and budget and work samples and target audience and all these different elements of the grant writing process. I like to think of it as looking at the entire document through a different lens, right? So you look at the narrative, you look at all these materials through the lens of the budget. What have I written about in the narrative that I haven't budgeted for yet? I'm looking at a photograph. Did I put in a line for somebody to take a photograph so that I can use that the next time, right? So that you really, and this takes a fair bit of like lead time to be able to do a grant in this kind of like mutually supportive fashion. But taking the time to look at it from a financial lens will really help you make a strong budget. And then another thing that I would suggest is like, Maine Arts Commission has their own budget format, right? With their own categories of spending and everything. National, the New England Foundation for the Arts, right, has a totally different one. The National Endowment for the Arts is a totally different one. So I would not start with that budget template necessarily. I would start with like your real world like costs. However you calculate your personal budget, however you write a shopping list is totally fine. It's a way to just capture that info. And then once you go to transporting that into the budget templates of various funders, that's a next step. But it really wants to make sense inherently to you so that you're really able to use these numbers in a meaningful way as you're starting to create your budget. So I think that's kind of how I get rolling, and I'm sure we'll get into some deeper stuff.
No, that's terrific. And just a reminder, if you have questions for these two, please go ahead and just throw them in the chat, and we will go ahead and ask them. So one thing you brought up was about lead time. We all have been, maybe you haven't, Heather, because you're just starting out, but we all have been at the night before starting the grant application. But how much lead time really do you take, or how do you figure out how much lead time you need to take in creating this?
I usually will, like, if I see an application or a grant that I want to apply for, I'll read through it and think about it and think, like we're saying, first of all, is this a good fit? Is what I want going to work for this? And then I usually like to spend like a week kind of sitting on that and thinking about it before sitting down to like actually write anything, or maybe I'll take some notes and just sort of like keep track of them. I earlier on in my career, I would start grants like 2 months before they were due and work on them and have several people read them. As I've gotten busier and as I write more grants and as I have more experience now, it takes me less time. But I would say as a general rule, I probably start about 2.5 weeks before something is due. Maybe a little bit sooner if it's a particularly big application. And then I also like to leave myself a little bit of room in case as I'm working on a grant, a question comes up. Like I think this summer, actually, one of the grants that I had applied for from Maine Arts Commission, I emailed Kristin and had a specific question, a question that was specifically about the budget and if the way that, if what I was putting in my budget was going to make sense for this application. So I think it's always good to give yourself some time in case as you're working on it, you know, you'll probably come up with a question or maybe need something to get clarified or asked of somebody.
That's great. And I will say that's a really important point. And it is unusual in the Maine Arts Commission compared to many other foundations, is that none of the staff are actually reviewers of the applications. So we're not making any of those financial decisions. Those are all folks who are reviewers for us. And so anybody on the staff can answer questions, look at drafts and all of that stuff. And I would really encourage you to take advantage of that. Ian, you were going to add some stuff.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of lead time, I'm a big fan of like letting it rattle around in the back of your brain, right? And really, like Heather said, like just reading through it once will spark questions, and then that kind of like passive, you know, your brain's downtime will say like, oh, I should, you know, reach out to Mark. Maybe his organization wants to be a second venue, and we can extend this to a tour and build off of that, right? And realizing that anything that you are not handling yourself, you need to give folks a lot of lead time so that they can fit it into their busy schedules. And getting answers from folks may not be a quick process because we're all so busy these days. And the answers that you then get from folks are going to, you know, mess up your numbers and your schedule and everything. And in a really good way, you know, it's kind of like field testing it, right? Road testing it. But definitely at least like a month in advance, I think is great to start to just draft it mentally, if not, you know, on the computer, on pen and paper.
Great, that's awesome. And then, you know, when you're putting together a budget, there's obviously two sides, the income and the expenses, and most of the focus for nonprofit organizations and for individuals, especially because it's a project-based budget, most of our focus is on the expenses and how we delineate those. And they basically fall into three pots of money. There's the grant money that you're asking for, and then there is whatever other money that you're bringing to the project, your cash match. And then there is this in-kind, which is dollars that aren't real dollars, but are people's time or things that you already have, or loans that, you know, of space or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about in-kind and matching funds and how you work towards those?
Yeah, if you can have in-kind things for your grant application, that's so helpful. I feel like in-kind donations have been so useful for me throughout my career. And like, for example, something that I've been able to do in kind now that I'm in Maine is I'll bring dancers from out of state, and I have people who house them. So that like takes up a huge chunk of my budget. That's super useful. And then I've also experienced different projects where people have been willing to let me use a space for free. So that ends up being an in-kind donation. If you have a great videographer friend or photographer friend and want to maybe buy them lunch or something, sometimes you can get that as in-kind. Yeah, those in-kind donations I think are really special because that's really a part for me of like community exchange and outreach and getting to know people. And it's always going to be difficult to be an artist. And I find that people are generally pretty willing to help out with things if they're able to. And then in terms of matching, I'll raise money in other ways through like a variety of different platforms. One big thing that I do a lot is personal fundraising and fundraising for the company. And we have over the years sort of come up with different times of year where we tend to focus that fundraising. So a lot of the matching that goes into my grant applications comes from outside fundraising that I've been doing.
I think another great thing about in-kind donations and that community building aspect, which is totally true, is that then you have invested partners in the project, right? People who know a little bit more about it. They're excited about the project. They're going to share information. They're going to show up to your performance or whatever it is that you're doing. And the more that you can involve them in a real way that helps the project, the stronger those connections can be. In terms of another thing, you see this grant cash, other cash, in-kind match, and another column that's often there is like status, right? It's either pending or it's secured. You're always going to have to ask somebody for money before anybody else, right? So you're trying to convince folks like, I think that what I'm pitching is like really solid. Do you want to take a step in? But those in-kind donations can be a great way to demonstrate buy-in up front before you have any cash in hand. We had at Mayo Street Arts, for example, we have 3 different hotels who are housing artists for us because nobody wants to stay in anybody's house during a pandemic. And nobody wants anybody in their house, right? So these hotels who have stepped up in a major way, saving us, thousands of dollars this season, also provide us a chance to ask other people for money and go, we have, $7,500 in-kind donations from hotels, and we're just looking for another $10,000 in cash to make this happen. Suddenly, it looks like you've secured a lot more of your budget, and functionally you have, as long as you know how to outline what's an in-kind expense there. And I think another thing about expenses is that there are always hidden expenses, and you start to get into patterns of if you're good, looking back at your budget after the project's over and going, oh man, I totally forgot about payroll tax, or I didn't put anything in for the building that we own that we're paying the heat and the phone lines and everything, that we use. So thinking of kind of ways to capture actual project costs can help make your budget stronger in the end. That kind of overhead expense, those sales tax expenses that on a large ticket item, that 5.5% really adds up. And I think that goes back to getting real world estimates, like Heather said, for your budget, and which applies to in-kind as well. If somebody's giving housing, how do you value that housing? You look at the cost of what it would take you out of pocket to get a hotel room to put that artist up for the night. And if that's a $250 hotel room in Portland, then that's a $250 in-kind offer. Same with videography and photography and other in-kind contributions.
And what about time? What about your time in preparing this application, in researching, and all the friends who are videographers that you talk to and all of that? Are you able to include that in your budgets? Do you think about that?
Could you clarify what you mean by time?
Well, the time that it takes you personally, that especially if you're an artist, if you're an independent artist, where you're not on the payroll, are you including that in the creation of your budget? Is there a value to your time, even if if you're not being paid, if no money is changing hands? Are you including it in kind, for example, as your own contribution?
Yes, I definitely would include that as in kind. I think a really good practice that I would definitely encourage is you should always, like when you're looking at your budget from the beginning, I think you should always factor in, an ideal scenario where you get to pay yourself and where you are compensating yourself for your time. Because I think that, it is labor, even doing like the application that you might not get is labor and time that you're spending. And I think that it's super important for artists, especially artists as individuals, to be the ones to point out the fact that it is labor, because other people don't necessarily realize like how much work goes into securing all of these things in order to make a project happen. So I would say if I'm able to, I'll always want to have a line in there to pay myself, or to at least value it in the way that David brought up as that being in kind. A lot of grant applications that I've done under sort of administration or fundraising staff or people who are working on that, a lot of that ends up being in kind because it's work that I'm doing. But I still think it's important to have that on there as a value, because without that time and without that labor, the grant application wouldn't exist if I didn't sit down to take the time that it took to write it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, your time is absolutely valuable and should be included. And I think this goes back to like my concept of lenses, right? If you write the narrative about the project, the description of what you're going to do, and then you have a budget, and then you start to look at a timeline and you go, we apply for grants here, design the program here, it goes to the printers here, and suddenly that as you create that timeline and start to think about who's working these times, that you start to gain more clarity around like the real manpower that's required to accomplish the things that you're budgeting for.
Yeah, we seem to have struck a nerve with the time questions, and that's terrific. And that, but yes, you want to come up with a per hour rate that your time is worth. And and if you think about it this way, if you're thinking about it in terms of somebody who's writing an application from an organization, and you've got the director and the producing director and the stage manager or whoever it is for that performance, and they're all salaried people, what the organization will do, what the grant writer ought to do, is say it's going to be this many hours, this percentage per week, 10 hours per week. And that's you can actually get to an actual number there, because that's 10% of their weekly salary and whatever that hourly rate is, as well as their benefits. And so there's an actual number there. You, I think, as an individual artist, have to also establish that number for yourself. And there is no given number that I know of. Maybe somebody else has a suggestion about that, but it's really got to be thinking about what is your actual hourly rate for this kind of work. And yes, Becky, it includes the project, soup to nuts. And so suddenly that might be a big in-kind number. Can in-kind supplies be art supplies and tools that I already own, as well as my time and dedicated studio space? And that, I think, is where you run into just use your best judgment, but also make sure your moral compass is pointed in the right direction, and make sure you're not overvaluing those items. And I think that a little bit of that element came up last week when we were talking to reviewers about reviewing, and that idea that you look at the project and you look at the budget, and they need to be in sync. They need to make sense. And if there's a red flag, the red flag is generally focused on there's something that's missing, or, you know, or this budget's way over the top in a sense, and both of those you sort of could tell. And I would say one of those examples might be housing. If you write a whole application about this project where you're going to bring in artists from New York, and you don't specify housing in your budget, somebody is going to flag that and say, well, where is that in your planning? And so that's those are really sort of the bare bones questions. Martin says, do you include grant writing fees in a budget? I think that probably the grant writing fees are probably, if an organization is hiring you to write grants, that's probably a part of your regular budget, not necessarily a project budget. But, you know, that's something to talk about, and you to make your own choice. So any final thoughts, Ian and Heather, on this? We want to move over to some nuts and bolts about the applications themselves.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Heather.
Oh, good. Both of you do. That's awesome.
I just wanted to add on to what David was just talking about making sure that your budget and your narrative and the whole package comes together to make sense. That I think that that's a really important place where it's good to have somebody read your application and take a look at your budget. Because it happens that, you know, when you're working on something like this, or you're working on your budget, where you might forget something that's important, or somebody might just like see something on there, like, you know, you talked about having somebody photograph this event or this project that you're doing so that you can use it for something later on, but you didn't include when that's happening in your timeline or something, or how much you're going to pay the photographer. So I think that's I think it's really useful to have somebody read over your application and to look at those things. And I still have somebody sit with me to go down line by line for each thing in my budget. And if I can't, you know, explain to that person what's this for and like, why is it this much, then it's like a red flag that like I need to go back and like figure out what that is. Because ideally, if, you know, you presented your application to a panel and you were in person and they were talking to you, if they asked you, you know, a question about a random line on your budget, you would be able to talk about it. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's a great suggestion.
The I guess the last that I have is like in terms of in-kind and like what kind of cash you can include. One general tip is like nobody wants to fund work that's already happened, expenses that have already taken place. So when you say like, I'm going to use all this wood that I've purchased over the past 10 years, like that's cash in hand. That might be an in-kind, but that's not like a cash contribution on your part, right? And the grant and what you're seeking funding for should make sure that those expenses are taking place after the funding is eligible. Like for the Maine Arts Commission, it's July 1st, right? They run like a July to June fiscal year. So if you're writing this grant in February, but you're going to have to like buy tennis shoes, you know, for whoever in March to make sure that they're like trained up by May, like those tennis shoes aren't in your budget, you know, because that's not like part of that's not part of what the project that you're funding. And in terms of in-kind, I got caught up for like a little while when I was getting started about like, well, IRS doesn't allow this to be a tax deduction, but this is a tax deduction. Like in-kind is a little broader than what the IRS accepts. IRS accepts goods or like they accept donated goods, right? If a you know, your buddy who's a plumber comes and fixes your plumbing, that can't be a deduction. They can't, you know, deduct that time on their taxes, but it's certainly a valid in-kind expense. So don't look at IRS for answers on how to use in-kind expenses. You'll get misinformation.
But I think that's a good, and I think that's a wonderful point and a good place to make a transition here, because we you also have to consider where the source of the funding is. And for a foundation, that's a different kind of funding than, for example, a state agency like the Maine Arts Commission. All of our funding is taxpayer dollars. And so if you aren't comfortable telling your ornery uncle at Thanksgiving across the dinner table what you're spending money on, that's probably not the best use of taxpayer dollars. And so you might want to really think about that. But I think there's a lot of ways that you make the case that what you're doing and the way you're spending money and the in-kind money that's coming in, all of those things make a really strong case in conjunction with that narrative. And as Heather mentioned, what you're trying to do is create an overall picture of a project that excites anybody who reads it and engages anybody who reads it. So in a way, you sort of take the reviewer by the hand and walk them through your process, your expenses, your ideas, and you lead them to a point where the only normal understood decision that they can make is, we've got to give this group money or this individual money for this wonderful project. And that's really how it can work. Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
I think like the narrative, the description really is like where you sell like the merit and the value. Like, why does this project need to happen? Why is it a baller dance that I'm creating, or things like that. But then the other, like the supplemental things like a budget or a timeline, provide confidence that you've like done your research. You are going to be able to execute it. You're going to be able to pay enough people to get the job done, so underselling your budget because I don't like that's your action plan, right? That's what gives confidence that you will be able to do all of the awesome things that you described and hook them with in your narrative.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. We're going to move over to Kristin here. Kristin, I have an idea for a grant, and I think I can apply. I heard the Maine Arts Commission has grants, and I want to get some of that money. What happens next?
Okay, well, I got some answers for you. So I want to touch on one or two things before I tell you how to get all the money that we've got in our accounts, on some things that I think are good. We had a question about a cash match versus the in-kind, which is cash match is money. So whether that's an investor or your own pocket money or another grant, that's whatever kind of money value stuff, money that's going into your project is a cash match. So that's versus the in-kind, which is more of a donated value. So this is monetary value in money form. So that's why we didn't touch on it too much, because it's pretty straightforward and a little less ambiguous than the in-kind. Something that Ian said about the timeline is really important, because your project, we at the Arts Commission will only fund the parts of a project that happen within our award cycle, which Ian said is July 1st to June 30th. But you could have a 3-year project that you're doing, and we'll fund the part of the project that happens within our grant cycle. So you could have a 10-year project, or you could have a 1-month project, and if it happens to fall into our cycle, we can cover the expenses that can get incurred within that year. So that's kind of how it works. So I guess first, if you're asking for money, I'll ask you, does your project take place within our funding cycle? Because if it doesn't, we can't really fund you. Come back later next year or build a time machine and do it that way. But we can't fund you if it's not within our award cycle. Also, just a quick note, if you're going to get an in-kind donation and the person's cool with sending you a letter of support about the kind of support they're giving you, that really helps reviewers get excited about kind of that community interest and action. So if you're getting somebody donating their house to the band who's going to be there for 4 days, have them write a really letter that we're really excited to be partnering with your organization or you as an artist and contributing this. And we hope that, our contribution inspires generosity on the part of a funder. That's really good. to include in sort of support materials. Also, I want to make sure you know with your project, David, that the Arts Commission does not offer needs-based funding, and that's not really a good way to think about your project.
Great.
We fund artistic excellence and merit. So if you're saying, I need this money because I'm really scraping by and it's really tough for me, and I mean, we may or may not fund you, but we're not going to fund you on the criteria that you need the money. We're going to fund you on the criteria that you're doing a great project and you're impacting communities and you're making a significant improvement to Maine's cultural landscape on some level, or hopefully you're talking in that way. So our reviewers are discouraged from ever thinking about the budget of an organization on whether they need the money or they don't need the money. It's really about, is this money going to be impactful for what its use is going to be, as described in the application. So really making sure your budget kind of aligns and displays that sort of impactfulness. And likewise, if you have a project of any kind of scale, usually a larger scale that has multiple things going on, try to align what you're asking the funder for with what they're most interested in. So if you're doing a dance at a lodge and you have to rent a band and a caller for the dance, or you can rent the lodge, like which expenses should you come to the Maine Arts Commission to support? And I would hope you would come to us saying we want to pay artists to perform and do the calling, and if that covers, and if we have enough money, if you get a good deal on the lodge, maybe that too, but otherwise get the lodge money from somewhere else, because that's not going to be as exciting to Maine Arts Commission reviewers usually. They'd much rather see the money go to artists. Just kind of aligning how you're talking about how you're going to spend our money that is taxpayer money is really a good strategy to have, not just with us, but with any organization, philanthropic organization you're going to. Really try to figure out what part of your project aligns best with what their mission is about. So if you'd like to get some money from us, though, I'd really recommend that you go to our website first and you check out sort of the buckets that we have and the way we want to see our money get used in the grants. And currently we've got 4 different core grants that we're offering that really will cover just about any project you want to do, depending on who you are. And I can talk about those now, or we can get back to the budgeting and
I think that's what we wanted. And so then let's talk a little bit about the budgeting. Kerstin, you have an opportunity to share the screen and show a sample budget.
I do. This is actually not just a sample budget. This is my.
Oh, right.
There we go. Folks see our very attractive budget form in our application portal. Folks got that? Great. So this is what you'll encounter when you wish to seek funding from the Maine Arts Commission. Is we've got an online system set up. You have some navigation pages here. So we have contact information about who you are, the contextual information about your project that helps us do our reporting to the NEA, the questions, which that's a whole other conversation about the narrative questions, but we do want you to link those questions in with your budget on a certain way and sort of develop both of those at the same time. Another thing that really is useful is thinking about your project in relation to a timeline too. Ian mentioned that, but I think that's kind of the third leg of the stool, as it were. If you have your budget, you have your narrative, and then you've got your timeline. And if you kind of have those 3 things, you've got a pretty good roadmap for what your project is going to be. And really, like what Ian and Heather were saying, is really what you're building is you're planning your project. You're building the roadmap on what you're going to follow. Sometimes grants don't come through for a couple of months. Funders have to the review process, and by the time you get the money, you're like, what exactly was I going to do with it? And so you go back to your grant that you wrote, and you're like, oh right, this money's going to go for this, and this is what I'm going to be doing with the product. Got it now. So it's really great to be as clear as you can, not just for the reviewers, but for yourself as well in that. And then uploaded materials, which is the support materials, like letters of support from your thing. And then we've got the budget information, which is right here. And this is what you'd be filling out if you were that we give to the reviewers when they evaluate the applications. It's a little tricky because we have these large text fields here that you can enter information into, but basically it's 4 different columns, and which is really just 3 columns because 1 autofills. So really we want to know what you're doing with this grant, So in this case, we're asking the Arts Commission for $4,200. What you're doing with your cash match, so what actual money you're bringing to the table, and then what you're doing as an in-kind match and how you can create additional value from that. And so we've got certain categories. You want to know what you're spending on your artists, basically, and then kind of for the project administration, what that's going to be. And then venue costs, you want to know what kind of the expenses are for kind of the locations, material purchases, marketing, mileage, planning, accessibility, and anything else. So that's kind of the general fields. You can add, it's really nice to help the reviewers more than just give the numbers. Some of our reviewers really love digging into the budgets and they can read the numbers like it's a book. Others don't even look at the budget very much, but they love the narrative about the budget. Like they just can't deal with the numbers. You know, different people do it different ways. So kind of spelling it out here where some reviewers might be like, yeah, I get it. That's what is happening between the projects and the cash. But then spelling it out saying this is going to be over an 18-month period. This is the total of the cost, which is going to equal what I'm asking for in the grant. And then eventually there's going to be additional folks coming onto this project because it's a project that spans outside the timeline of the funding cycle. So you have an opportunity to kind of clarify this within our system. Again, project administration. If you can, talk about how folks are administering it. Be specific if you can. So what is Bob's job that he's doing? What's Susan's job? As specific as you can. If there's not enough room here, putting this kind of thing in the support materials is great. So you can again add to that. Reviewers primarily are scoring on what they read in the application, followed by, which includes the budget, and then kind of followed by the support materials. So if you can connect everything together, it really builds a stronger application. And then just sort of evaluating what you do. At the very end, we offer a chance to kind of explain it to the reviewers that aren't as good with number fields. So you can really talk about that. And then at the very end, we also offer some of the definitions that how we see the information that we want within these fields. So we kind of explain it to you. So that's pretty much what we are looking for. And if all the numbers are filled in right, we'll get a really good picture of how this grant is fitting into your overall project, and however you define that project. So if it is fitting into an 18-month project and you want to talk about, well, actually the total cost of this is going to be, I think we do talk about that it's
right down below, yeah.
Yeah, down below, that this is just within this cycle, and next year we're going to probably have a whole bunch more expenses that we're going to do, but we really want to make you aware as a reviewer, we're not seeking money for the production part of this. We're just kind of doing the planning and evaluating, and that's what you're funding. So hopefully the reviewers know exactly what they're funding when they're looking at this, and not like, well, it's going to this project, but they're paying artists, but I'm not sure if those artists are, what are those artists doing? You know, are they the dancers, or are they who, like $4,200 doesn't get a lot of artists. I mean, it gets some, but like who are we doing, and why are we focusing on those with this grant money? That's really good things to answer for the reviewers. I'm gonna
move right up there a little bit to that one line where the producers are listed, where Joe and whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And so here's an example of a great question about in-kind versus cash match. And so in this listing, the money, the salary draw percentage that they have is that $7,500, but they're doing an additional $10,000 worth of in-kind, volunteer. Yeah, is that what you're suggesting here?
That's how we said it. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. So maybe I'm unstable now, but apparently, so in this, it's $7,500 and then a $10,000 in-kind. And so my assumption is that that's the 7,500 is their actually salary, their draw salary.
They're drawing that, yes.
And then their 10 grand is their time.
Their time after
additional
work
time.
when they're putting in the hours, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a great example of how to split up and how to use that in kind in a way. And that they valued their time based on that cost.
I think that's a great example of what Heather was saying of like getting someone else to read your budget and having to defend it. And that question should be answered in a good grant budget, right? Like the little boxes, the text boxes below could very easily say, Bob, contractor, X amount cash, X amount in kind. The more that you can spell those out and double check that the numbers still add up to what what the total is, and anticipate and answer those questions in advance, the fewer red flags are going to come up within the review panel.
And there's a question, Kirsten, about the idea of grant pending. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's just a nice way to say you haven't gotten the money yet. You put a grant out in the sector and you're hoping that the reviewers will like you. You've gone to a number of organizations trying to get support and they haven't had their reviews yet, but it's out there and you may get the money. So it's pending.
Yeah. Great.
I guess you'd also call it unsecured or unsecured, but I like pending better.
Yeah. Yeah. And then if you already have the money in hand, you would say received.
Secured or received. I think
secured or whatever.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So I said it's
secured. Sure. Yeah. And I know we're going to lose Ian in a few minutes because he's got another project to go to. But are there any questions that anybody has? You can throw them in the chat. So, and Randy says you can use the money you applied for, but you may not get. And I think that when you're creating the project budget, that's part of the project budget. You're looking for your sources of funding. But it's what we're not requiring is that you have all your cash in hand.
Yeah. And to be just one more thing, you actually do two budgets with the Maine Arts Commission. You do this one with your application and then you do another one for the final report. So and we understand, especially over the past couple of years, that projects get modified in ways, and sometimes what you were going to use for your budget needs to be altered in a way in order to make the project happen, like putting it online or using different resources and things, and so that's and that's fine as long as we talk about it. Like we understand that things happen, but there's two kinds of accountability here. One is the budget you're hoping to use, and then there's the budget you actually used at the end of your project. And hopefully everything lined up for you and they're just spot on together. But if there's a little bit of wiggle, we understand and don't care. If there's a lot of wiggle, talk to us. And
we'll say why that is, right? So there's three questions that are all kind of related. One is about if the application isn't pending to the foundation, but they have a deadline. Our deadline is April 15th and their deadline is June 1st. And I can go ahead, but that grant is included in my budget that's not going to start till September or something. I can include that application in there, and I just need to probably say when the application date is rather than say pending.
Yeah, I would say when the opening date is. So application opens February 2nd, so we know that February 2nd comes, that organization puts the grant up online, you're there to fill it out. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, that passes the sniff test.
Yeah. And so is it a good idea to apply for funding for the same thing to multiple funders and indicate that in the grant? And the reality is you're not very often going to get all the money you need from one source, and so you sort of have to go about that.
That it kind of comes back to we don't we don't care at the Arts Commission. In fact, we like to see hustle in our applicants. So the fact that you're out there looking for other funding for your project is terrific for us, and usually the reviewers like that too. We don't have a problem with by multiple entities for the same project. That's terrific and kind of the way of the world.
Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I also think that I think it makes it a more attractive application, and I also think that if you're applying for funding from a couple of different places, and you're like, the more community partners and the more people that you can show to people that are reviewing your work, that you have these people who are supporting you, and that you know, you're putting yourself out there to get in touch with people. I think, like, artists never make projects with, you know, just one person or from one organization. It's generally tends to be like multiple organizations who are supporting them, different residencies. Like, there's all these different kind of pieces that go together for it. So I think, like, for sure, if you're working on a grant application with Maine Arts Commission, and then you see something like maybe for NEPA that could also fund a different aspect of it, I think it's a great idea to be really like widening your network of where you're applying for resources.
Mm-hmm. And then just a quick confirmation that mileage is certainly acceptable expense for your budgets. And go ahead, Kristin. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably not something you want to necessarily seek from the Maine Arts Commission if there's other expenses that are a bit more arts focused, but it's definitely something that goes in the budget that you should be accounting for, because that's important. And if you don't know, I think the state, I don't know what each organization has it different, but I think the state does 44 cents per mile, if that's useful for you in thinking about cost value of miles traveled.
IRS is 58 cents a mile this year. You guys
Yeah.
are getting gypped.
We are. I know.
Exactly. No question. And then there's an interesting question from Martin England. Can we apply for grants to pay for artists and musicians who help us fundraise? So I think if you're having your gala,
Right. Yeah.
event or whatever, I suspect that's what that is.
I mean, I think that's fine. I know we talk about fundraising and capital campaigns as not really being eligible for our funding, but I think I don't believe the artists are performing at a venue. They're performing for an event, and I think that I'll need to think about that a little bit more. But it seems like it passes the sniff test for me that paying artists to do their art in a venue is fine. And really, what we're talking about is other kinds of fundraising that would be prohibited.
He adds, we host regular events and pay artists and musicians to help us raise money for the future generations of artists and musicians. So it sounds like it's part of their regular work.
Yeah.
So then I think that becomes a different thing. The project grant said that that a match is not required. And that must mean the Springboard grant do not have a match requirement, Titus.
Yeah, that is our introductory lowest barrier grant that we offer for folks who haven't been funded by us before. So there's the fewest barriers with that, and the matching, as we've talked about it for 20 minutes here, it gets a little weedy. So we've made that not a thing for the Springboard.
And it's really, and this is a great example also of, it's really important to read the guidelines for that specific application that you're looking at, because the guidelines are different in different applications. As Ian mentioned, the budget form is different for different organizations, who are granting funding. Martha, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just gonna sort of weigh in a little bit about paying artists at an event that's a fundraiser.
Mhm.
I think it, you could certainly ask in a grant, and this is my opinion. I don't think, I think it's how you write that in the narrative. I think, Martin, what you wrote about to raise money for future generations of artists and musicians, I think that has a little bit more strength to it. I don't think that, I don't know, but my guess is that a reviewer might not really feel like funding a fundraiser is what they want to use our public monies for. So I think it's how you frame it in the narrative is really going to make the difference on that one.
And I would, yeah, I would then come back to Heather's earlier statement about the whole thing coming together. And one of the questions certainly is, what is the community impact, and who is the audience? And if your audience is, oh, thank you, Ian. Ian's got to run, but thank you so much. And this will be our last. It is 7 o'clock, so we'll head out. But it's really important, I think, that you think about, well, who are these applications? I mean, who is this entertainment for? Who are these musicians performing for? And what is the public benefit of that? And so I think if you're having a fundraiser, part of the way that you make money in a fundraiser is you get all of the parts of the fundraiser sponsored, so that all the donations actually go towards the thing you're fundraising for, rather than the cost of having a fundraiser. And if you've ever been involved with a fundraiser that takes lots of time and lots of effort and actually doesn't raise any funds, there's probably nothing more disheartening than that. So try to avoid that at all costs. Well, we are here at time, and I just wanted to thank you all, Heather and Kirsten and Martha in particular, and Ian, for your insights here, and thank you all for your questions. You can always reach out to us and ask more questions. We're happy to talk to you, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks so much.